Hey, this is Paul at FocusPulling.com. Haven't done one of these in, it seems like a year. Been kept busy making movies. But this Sony RX0 just arrived, and so I figured on the early side of things I would give it a whirl with some test footage, kind of dig into the menus, and also do something I haven't seen yet posted, which is to capture 4K. You'll see that although it looks kind of bright, of course this is my cell phone just getting some externals, the issue that we're going to run into first off is that I needed to kind of do this towards the end of the day because those zebras are at 95%. And S-Log2, which is the first example we're seeing here, you'll see that it's at 1600 ISO. And even then, we have to go to 1/400th shutter speed, which really violates the 180-degree shutter rule because at 30 frames per second, I really need to be at 1/60th. We switch over now to Adamus Shogun that's connected to the HDMI output, and this is where the product sort of really shines in an amazing way because without any pixel binning, it's getting a full sensor readout from the 4K sensor. Now, it is a 1-inch sensor. I think a lot of people are mistaking that to be larger than Super 35, but it's actually significantly smaller. But what I'm also doing through these samples is I'm sort of waving a wand over from left to right to show you a comparison with 4K on the left and 1080p on the right. So it's the same settings and the same location. And as we zoom in real quick, you can really get a close look at that kind of warped, almost centered US Capitol of the difference in resolution quality, which is, of course, something you'd expect. But here now, for the first time, you're seeing the native quality of the RX0 without any picture profile. So those S-Log2 clips that you saw, I just converted those to Rec 709 with the standard Sony converters. But they did have better dynamic range. I think these highlights have less detail in them. On the other hand, you'll notice some interesting kind of color discrepancies. And I'm still working that through. It's definitely more dramatic on the Shogun in terms of how it ingests the S-Log color and so on. Not sure what that's about. But here you can see actually the colors look sort of richer. I think that goes to a fundamental complaint about Sony's log formats altogether, where this color is just not up to par with, say, Blackmagic or even Canon. But here, as it's getting darker, I'm able to lower my ISO to something that is getting closer to, a proper motion blur. The thing is, there's nothing really moving fast, so the lack of a proper shutter speed really isn't a problem. Here, I thought I'd give a try at, shallow depth of field. Now, anything's going to have shallow depth of field when it's this close. This is about a half meter away. Shameless self-promotion. That's my thing that's actually kept me busy all year, but I just used that as a foreground device. In 4K, though, what I'd like to do here is sort of like zoom in really quick, and when we zoom in really quick, we'll see that one of the Achilles heels of this product, as exciting as it is the fact that there's moire and just a lot of noise. So it's a catch-22 because in order to even start in S-Log2, it begins at 1600 ISO and goes up from there. That's the minimum ISO. So this is a really noisy sensor and a noisy Bions processor at 1600. This is definitely not the kind of quality you see on an A7S II with full frame, let alone an A7R2 with Super 35. Here we're pointing towards the Washington Monument, getting a little more of the backlighting more dramatically. You can see the dynamic range is more evident, but the colors are really kind of vibrant. Now, this again is with no picture profile. The noise levels are manageable because they're at 200 ISO. But when we go next to the S-Log samples, this is where in particular I was really sort of, if not disappointed, at least seeing that I needed more work to do when it comes to dealing with the color of the RX0. But first, here we are seeing a comparison of just the resolution quality between the 1080p on the right and the 4K on the left. And just I'll mention it again, on the left, that is an Adamus Shogun from the micro, or I guess it's mini HDMI output on the Sony RX0. So here's what I was talking about. The colors are just sort of yuck, right? That is a standard S-Log2 S gamut converter to Rec 709. So I don't know. what that's all about. But what is definitely evident here is that at 1600 ISO with a 1/60th shutter speed, the noise is just going crazy. Now, if I had an ND filter and this were brighter in the day, I think this would even get worse because we have another layer of sort of effects on the image quality. So one of the lessons of this product is that you really can't use it outside in the log modes at all because of that 1600 minimum. In this shot, basically what I'm doing is I'm seeing what is possible in terms of hand holding this thing, and I'm really holding it steady. I mean, this is even a extremely sort of stationary use case where I'm really digging my shoulders into my stomach and using that as a prop. So if this is as steady as I can get it, it means that ergonomically it's really rough holding this thing steady. You could use warp stabilizer, but when you're shooting internally at 1080p, that's not going to be great. And here, the prior shot was an S-Log2 converted, and then this is just the no picture profile shot with me trying to hold it as steady as I possibly can. So basically, this is the sort of ideal lighting environment when it's not too bright, and we can try to use the log format, which was one of the great appeals of this camera. But next, we're going to go underground, and we're going to see how we deal with really low light situations. But I'm really hardcore about the 180-degree shutter rule, especially when there's motion. So when we have a subway train going by in the next shot, I really want to keep it at 1/60th shutter speed. So in order to have it at that shutter speed with no picture profile, I'm at 640 ISO, which is pretty high. The noise is there and it's pretty evident. Now the noise is getting a little masked by the shadows being kind of crushed in this environment. I'm not needing to lift them very much. But again, with no picture profile, 640 ISO, the motion blur looks good, but I think you're going to see a lot of amateur kind of footage coming out of the RX0 where they just let the shutter speed run around. I have failed to mention the reason why this dilemma exists is because you cannot adjust the aperture on this thing. That's why I mentioned ND filters being so critical before, because the aperture is fixed at a sort of theoretical f4.0, an equivalent f4.0. So you have to be sort of constantly moving the ISO up and down and making your grain vary considerably, and that's just not an ideal situation.
So here's the first page of the first menu tab, and I thought that one of the best ways to get acquainted with a new product is just to dig through the menus. So we're going to spend a few minutes just basically doing a deep dive through every single feature in the menu that I've mostly gotten acquainted with over the past few days. I might miss a few things, but you can kind of think of this also as a tutorial on how to use the Sony RX0. And the good thing is that any of us who have used another Sony camera have sort of a head start because the menu system is surprisingly similar given how incredibly tiny this camera is. A lot of the same features are there under the same tabs and so forth. But the first thing you'll notice is since there's no sort of mode dial on this thing, when you land on page 1 of the first tab, you actually aren't at the place where you would maybe be getting to the first place you want to be. And really what that is over here in shoot mode on the second page of the first tab. And then when you click that, you are able to select between a variety of modes. So where you're going to probably spend most of your time, since I'm really creating this mostly for kind of videographers and filmmakers, it'll for sure be in manual exposure with that film strip icon, which means movie mode. So unlike some other cameras, you can't actually start shooting movies from a camera mode. And you actually have to go directly there. So the record button, or the shutter button, if you will, on the top of the unit, it only sort of starts movies if you're in movie mode and pictures if you're in picture mode. So when we're in manual movie mode, then we can select it by hitting that enter button and then go back. And there we are sort of on a screen. But let me go back to the menus. When we go to the shoot mode and just sample some of the other modes, we'll just sort of see how basically useless they are, because here it's telling you that it'll automatically set the shutter speed for movies, and then other settings can be set as desired. So the warning that I sort of previewed in the prior sections when we were looking at visual samples is that if you let the shutter speed move all over the place, then you're going to get that sort of stroby, amateur-looking GoPro footage. And so being able to manage your shutter speed so that you get proper motion blur, especially if you want to blend this footage with other professional and better quality cameras, you sort of don't want to be in this mode unless you really have to. And for example, if you don't have ND filters, which this camera isn't even shipping yet, the ND adapter, it will still be a huge hassle. During the daytime, yes, it's possible that you need to raise the shutter speed to crazy amounts like I did for those first shots in the samples. There is this even crazier intelligent auto film shooting mode, video shooting mode. Here it really goes nuts, and I just think that anyone who's serious about making films would not use this mode. Back to the menu. Let's go back a page, actually. And so it's grayed out the still image features here for the most part. I mean, we can anticipate and set what the still picture image size is going to be, the aspect ratio, and some of these ISO issues and limitations. We probably wouldn't be switching over to Adobe RGB. This is not a pro still camera. So anyways, let's go to page 2. And page 2, that's that shoot mode thing that we use to basically simulate the top dial on a lot of Sony cameras. And so we also have this sort of still picture controls, including single shooting, bracket settings. Here, I'm going to sort of, abstain from really getting into this because I just can't figure the sucker out. There is a memory, add and memory recall thing. So if anybody wants to add in the comments the grand solution to this, I spent about a half an hour and just gave up. I'm finding that it doesn't seem possible to sort of save any of these things, because when you, let's say, go to a new memory bank where you want to save the current settings, if you will, you just press OK, and then it just doesn't seem to do anything, and you'll see that recall is grayed out. So sort of don't know what's going on there, but I'm sure it's either me not figuring it out, Sony having a bad UI, or maybe they just need to upgrade it with firmware. I don't know. So page 3, focus issues. So the RX0 is a bit of an odd bird. It has a manual focus that is strange. Let's go back actually to that mode, and here basically you'll see that in the set focus sort of workflow, you tap the enter button basically, and then you have a very limited range to be able to, whoops, didn't mean to do that. When you're in that focus mode, you use the left and right buttons to sort of change the focus length from 0.5 meters to infinity. So it's a shallow-ish depth of field, but really not too shallow, especially with a fixed lens. So manual focus basically is doing that. Now, so when I go back to the menu, this will all be clear when we see what the other options we have are. And so there's manual focus, but there's also this thing called preset focus. And basically what that means is you can temporarily go into sort of close-up subject mode and then pop back again. So by default, when you're in this PF, preset focus mode, it'll land you at the place where you're probably going to be almost all the time, which is, wide landscape, infinite focus, things far away from you. If you tap this once, it just toggles into quote near mode, and that means that things that are nearby you are in focus. And then you toggle it again, goes back, canceled near mode. So in reality, actually, that probably will work out in most people's workflows with this, miniature simplistic camera. But again, that other mode It's really not so bad. It's just that, yes, you're using tiny little keys, but if you do go into this manual focus mode, sure enough, then when you push the enter button to set focus, you're just doing this. And by the way, you can't see it now because I don't have it set up this way with the Shogun, but basically you can then in turn see a magnified version of things, and then we'll see later on that there are peaking functions. Now, what about autofocus, right? So that's the problem, is that this camera doesn't have autofocus for video, and it certainly isn't continuous. So you can see grayed out, right? Single shot AF, not available in manual exposure mode, which is where we always want to be. So that's a bummer. But you can't have everything, right? But when it comes to the focus area for when you're in still picture mode, sure enough, you can specify sort of the typical usual suspects, right? So no need to get into this. And anyways, this is not very sophisticated of a camera where we would be, these are not deal breakers, right? So back to the menu. I'm going to skip some of these because a lot of these have to do with focus things that are not going to be relevant to videography, right? Because we're manual focusing all the time anyway. On page 4, this is another place where you're going to be spending a lot of time changing things, because inevitably, yes, you're going to have to move your shutter speed around in tandem with your ISO to manage the crazy way that this is a fixed f4.0 aperture. So when it gets bright outside, there's no easy solution to this. So let's look at how far the ISO goes down. And we can see that when we're in S-log2, that's what I was talking about, all grayed out. So we have no ability really to, so to speak, darken the image or bring it to its native ISO. And we're stuck with this noisy ISO because of the log curves. And that's just a fact of the way it is. We'll be able to adjust the ISO below 1600 when we get to the picture profile mode later. But then again, one of the great appeals of this little camera was its ability to shoot an S-log2, match it with other cameras. That's at least for me. Here we go more with the sort of metering stuff that, again, I think a manual filmmaker is kind of less inclined to use, but we'll kind of skip through that. White balance, it's kind of the usual thing you come to expect, right? So all these. I believe that, I could be wrong, but the whole ability to grab white balance, I know that on my A7S II, this whole ability to set it based on, let's say, a white card or something, is, to my recollection, complicated for video mode, and it involves this sort of laborious method of sort of going to still photography mode, setting white balance, and going back to video. I seriously doubt that that's improved here. But let's go to the important part. Skipping picture effect, which is really goofy. That's that whole, is it a landscape or a sports or whatever. Not going to use that. But with picture profiles, you can see I have it set to picture profile 7. So when I go there, you can see that there's a menu here where I can turn it off. So in some of my video samples that you just saw, I either was in picture profile off, and then skipping through all these, which are sort of like standard, vivid, cine, whatever. When we're talking pro S-log2 gradable footage, to the extent that we can deal with this crazy noisy sensor, let's just verify some of these settings that we really wouldn't mess with. But we can see, yes, indeed, it's S-log2. Also note, importantly, that it's color mode S-gamut. There are other choices, but when you choose S-gamut, then that means that you need to remember that when you pick your Rec 709 conversion, or let's say you're like me and you use Film Convert, then you want to load up the correct profile, camera profile, that's not only S-gamut, S-log2, but also the S-gamut color mode. So that exposes that. But anyways, going back a step, we are selecting picture profile 7. Normally, if we want to basically maximize this camera, but yeah, there was that ISO problem. So let's go ahead and turn picture profile off. And then when we go to the prior page and go down to ISO, now, look, they're not grayed out anymore. Now I can really go down pretty far, 125. And in 125, then with my fixed f4.0 aperture, I might have a fighting chance at not overexposing. So we're going to leave that there for now. But moving past the picture profile, which is currently off, this other stuff is useful when it comes to manual focusing. Manual focus assist works in tandem with this, basically to say that as you start manually focusing, it creates an enlarged portion of the frame, and then it either lasts for a certain set amount of time, or it just stays magnified until you do something else. So that's what that setting is for. Having it on is a great idea. Peaking level, especially on this dinky little screen, I found that it needs to be high rather than some of these other settings. And then peaking color red certainly was a good idea because sort of white gets lost. And again, it's all a symptom of this tiny screen. Next page. Face detection. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be when you are doing still photography, which is sort of an optional auxiliary feature of this camera. And even then, definitely not as sophisticated as something like an A7R2, or now 3 this week, right? Okay, so we've made it through the first tab, and then moving a little quicker, but importantly, here we get to the second tab, which gets into some of the movie settings that are really what we're here for. And when it comes to file formats, XAVC SHD, yeah, so that's a highly compressed codec, and they give us that. Of course, it's always been funny to me that Sony continues to offer these sort of legacy formats, as if compatibility is any problem these days for anybody serious about video. So we're always going to be XAVC SHD. So just a reminder, you've probably heard, this does not shoot 4K internally. But even at 1080p, XAVC SHD is such a processor-intensive codec that basically there is, even on this product, the same overheating problems that, you know, sort of dogged the A7 series. We'll get to that because there's a setting for that. In the record setting under the category of XAVC SHD, we have these choices. So it's funny how, you know, you have the ability to do 60p. You know, I don't shoot 60 a lot, and if I anticipate I'm going to do slow motion and need 60p, then I'll probably use a better camera for slow motion. But if you wanted the flexibility to use 60, then there you are. And without entering high frame rate mode, which is to say recording it in slow motion itself, but rather letting you do that in post later, sure enough, there's a 120p codec too. Notice that the codec bitrate is 50 megabits per second in all of these modes. That's interesting. I mean, a lot more frames, 60 frames per second, and certainly with 120p. It just goes to show you how basically they're using the same bitrate throughput, if you will, and just sacrificing or compromising other features as we increase or decrease frame rates. So at 120p, of course, the resolution and just the overall compression quality goes way down, and still we're at 50 megabits per second. So it's kind of clues you into what's going on there. High frame rate settings. There, once again, you can set what the parameters are once you get into the high frame rate mode. Just to remind you, that was the mode when we go here. I'll get to the function menu in a little bit later, but when you, or I'm sorry, not there, it's here. There's basically a hotkey, a shortcut. When you push the left arrow by default, it brings you back to here where you can select between the modes. So there was that HFR mode. And moving along, so let's skip those. Audio recording on. Cool. So what I'm recording with right now is this crazy doodad that's actually a tiny portable sort of non-wired, just sort of plug with lavalier mic thing that's going straight into the mini jack. So this is audio from a cheap but not so bad Sony little mini lav mic that just basically has a plug on the other end of it, and it's going into the mic jack. But it is kind of cool that at least they give you a mic jack. I mean, there have been some, A-series bigger shooters than this in the past that didn't have a mic jack, and here we have it. So you can shoot actually a documentary with this thing. So when you have audio recording on, you can also set the levels, and besides that, you can make sure that the VU meters show up on the screen. So you've seen this before, but here I am again. See the VU meter dancing while I talk? Okay. Marker display, that's interesting, sort of like complement or supplement to another kind of marker. But here you can get more complicated things like different aspect ratios, which just is so comical, right? So for example, like we could choose all of these complicated, like indie film, cool 2.35:1, which is like, vintage CinemaScope. I won't get into it, but yeah, there's a lot of indie filmmakers who are ready to be, Lawrence of Arabia on their first feature, and they use 2.35:1. But that's what this mode is for creating basically frame guides for non-conventional aspect ratios and other things, right? So it's just customizing the viewfinder basically. And are you going to do that on this size camera and for this use set? Doubtful, right? Okay. So I'm moving to page 3, and this is trivial stuff like, does the monitor turn off during recording? Yes, that's good. It saves the battery. Do you want the record lamp on while you're recording? Privacy stuff, whatever. Zebra stripes. So there's healthy debates about what's a good zebra to use. If you want to, so to speak, expose to the right, then keeping your zebra pretty high is a good strategy. But not letting it be at a full 100 gives you a little bit of latitude for those extra moments when you might accidentally blow out highlights. So I think I've landed on, for S-Log, at least in the Sony ecosystem, to have zebras be at 95%. That means that when you're almost at full brightness, full white, basically bright sky, you start seeing zebras at just before the brightest you should be at. And then from there down, if you expose so that the brightest thing in your shot has just a little tease of zebras in it, then you have the latitude to be able to, keep your shadows lifted enough, and the maximum latitude later on in post to do color correction. So skipping through some of these things, the auto review is actually after you take a still picture. It shows it to you for 2 seconds afterward. Custom key, this is kind of important, and yet I didn't find myself deviating from Sony's choices. You can basically, there's so few buttons on this thing anyway, so you can specify that the enter button on the back panel initiates manual focus mode and adjustment of manual focus, and then the left button, which is the one right next to the menu button, that toggles between the shoot modes, which is super handy since there's no dial like on the A7 series or basically any other camera in the world. So that's what that's for. Kind of, you're probably going to end up going with the defaults. Yeah, I mean, heavens, the audio signals thing, what's funny about that is that if you do have it on, right, like all, then every time you start and stop, it'll actually record the noises of the little reactive dings. So when you're into video, that's probably not something you're going to want to have on. I didn't mind having it on for shutter, which is just for still photography, where sound is irrelevant. Okay, I'm going to skip through this because, but only to note that, yeah, I mean, a really compelling use for this, given the tiny screen, given the idea of this being like this stealth portable device. I plan to use this, although now I'm really concerned given the fact that the 1-inch sensor, which still sounded really large to people, it's still really tiny compared to Super 35 and especially to full frame. So that ISO problem and the noise in log modes is just going to be a huge problem when I want to use this for my desired use case, which is like like multicam shoots of concerts in clubs, or in any case where lighting is not outside and glaring and ideal. So finding that balance is going to be super tricky. But I still had envisioned, though, in that case, that since you can connect up to 5 of these to one smartphone in this sort of interesting sort of token ring hub, where one of the RX0s becomes the master and then there's a bunch of slaves, then that means that you could be doing a shoot sitting behind one camera and then have up to 5 of these at other locations and kind of have master control from one big tablet or smartphone. So that's kind of cool. Not all of these are going to that issue, but sure enough, you have all of these typical play memories options. And Bluetooth is kind of interesting. They also have additionally Bluetooth functionality, which actually lets you turn on and off the device remotely. So one can imagine, like, if you've mounted this like on a ceiling somewhere and you don't want the battery to last. Granted, there is a USB port on this thing so that you can receive bus power to keep it going longer, but then that actually makes it overheat faster and so on. But anyways, Bluetooth is another sort of parallel feature to Wi-Fi where you can actually turn it on and off, among other things. We'll skip playback. I mean, it basically does all the stuff that you expect playback to do, right? And finally, okay, setup. Home stretch. I'm so stoked that it has gamma assist, and it's kind of amazing that there was a period. It just reminds you of how, I just have to be honest and say, I don't sort of have anything to lose by saying so. Sony is such a villainous, overpriced company, and I remember there was a moment when they were threatening to charge for firmware upgrades that were going to include features that they left out of certain products in their product line, because they're all about tiered pricing and, you know, justifying the higher price for a higher product and all this stuff. I think it was either the FS5 or the FS7. But anyways, now Gamma Assist is just this sort of no-brainer must-have feature because, yeah, it's hard to expose when you can't see what it's going to look like after you convert log footage to Rec 709. So what this does is it basically automatically detects when you're in a log mode. It sort of punches the color back to Rec 709 so that you don't have that sort of unsaturated, milky look, and you get a better rendition of what it'll look like. I think auto is the only mode you'd ever want to be in because it does a good job of ascertaining which mode. So forcing it to be in S-Log2 could be a big problem because if you're not in the log PP7 mode, then it'll actually punch your images way beyond what you want, at least on the viewfinder. I mean, it'll save it without applying this. So again, this is only for viewfinder purposes. It doesn't burn this gamma assist into the stored footage or even into a photograph. So this is fun. I remember making a lot of noise about this, and then I've been quiet for a long time, like I said, making movies, in fact. But yeah, when I used to be passionate about this, it was kind of amazing to me that Sony, for a long time, didn't deal with the fact that all of their 4K cameras were overheating after sometimes 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And then you had a bunch of sort of, you know, I don't know, vloggers and even famous ones, who shall be nameless, sort of righteous indignation against those who would complain about it because any serious filmmaker never shoots for more than 5 minutes at a clip. But even if you were shooting in short 5-minute bursts, the fact that it would shut down after, you know, a session that lasts 30 minutes was a huge barrier to productivity. So Sony has basically sort of endangered the component life of their products by letting these things get super hot. But now it's funny, the manuals have these like stark warnings about how you might burn yourself, and we're not responsible if you do. So it's like, okay, fine, I'm a big boy. So I think that anybody would want to have it on high because, you know, it's like, did you learn when you were a kid not to touch the stove when it's hot? So you can see their lawyers make sure that you see this warning message. And yeah, if it gets too hot, then I'll know. I mean, it's not so hot that you would get injured or something, unless you're incredibly stupid. moving along. Flip, that's kind of cool because there's one 1/4" 20 socket on the bottom, so if you had to mount it so that it's upside down, you can flip it. It doesn't auto flip, but oh well. It's a world camera. You can flip between NTSC and PAL. It causes a reboot. HDMI settings. So when you connect, right now actually I have 4K output off. Oops, sorry. I'm on another page, aren't I? There we go. I have 4K off. Now if I turned it on right now, what I wouldn't be able to do is to do this overlay of the menus. So you have to affirmatively turn it on to get the full non-pixel binned clean 4K output from this product, but as you saw from the samples, I was really impressed. So it looks much better than the native 1080p in more ways than just resolution. So in more ways than resolution, by that I mean that because it's downsampling from a large pixel sensor, a 4K ready sensor, or actually usually a little more than 4K, that downsampling is introducing all kinds of aliasing and moire. So I mentioned that when I zoomed in to 3x on the backpack, and you could see the problems that were not only the noise causing it, but also typical downsampling problems. Anyway, so when you are connected to like an Adamus Shogun or some other 4K recorder, it's only then that this shows the ability to turn on or off. I was confused by that at first because I thought it wasn't working. It's grayed out if you don't have an active connection to a 4K recorder. And then in HDMI settings, most of these are sort of 1080p centric, including especially this one that I'm using right now. And also some of these are sort of, usually not going to be something you use, like these control for HDMI and record control. It's kind of funny how people bicker and sort of complain about these, and Adamus had to do a firmware upgrade, damage control. For me, if I'm using a Shogun monitor, to push the record button on the Adamus Shogun is anyways preferable to using the record trigger on the tiny little camera, in this case especially. Anyways, we'll just move on. All right, almost at the end. USB connection. So you can power, you kind of have to actually power the device, charge the battery through the USB port, but it does some other things too. So you can also offload the files. The micro SD card, the way it goes into the slot, it's sort of ornery, and it's because of Sony's comically outdated but still hanging on for dear life memory stick format. It's a little too big, and so it very much jiggles into place until you can finally put it in. So there's an incentive to leave the micro SD card always in the device and just to use the USB connection to, in this case, we would select mass storage to be able to transfer files. So that's what that's about, and a few other even less useful things. Okay. And there we have the USB charging, basically. Power supply. Also, again, as a reminder, you can get like a $10 to $20 really powerful USB brick and have this sucker go on for a long time. They do warn in the manual in very tiny print that actually, compared to using a battery, this sucker will overheat faster if you're using a USB bus power supply than if you're using a battery. I found that kind of interesting because theories have gone in the other direction, in fact, in the past. All right. And home stretch. Here we are. Let's look at let's go one more page to be final. Yeah, we're not going to reset after all this work, right? And here we are on the version. So that is wrapping up the deep dive into the menus of the Sony RX0 version 1.0. Will they add firmware features? I don't know. I mean, I was already sort of amazed by the number of features that are already jammed into this tiny camera, and indeed this tiny screen that you can barely see. So, they sort of nailed it, and I think people are going to keep bitching about how it doesn't do internal 4K. I also have heard, again, shall remain nameless, prominent bloggers, influencers, and Sony salesmen saying, why would anybody want to shoot with an attached 4K recorder, and what's the value of even having 4K sample footage, and so on. So I have a couple of 4K recorders, like a Shogun, and then I upgraded. On top of that, I can tether these things from a kind of hard to get to location during certain types of shoots, and then have a long HDMI cable come to my A camera or even my B camera to make this my D and E and F camera. So the quality at 4K of this sucker is absolutely amazing, and the ability to shoot in S-Log2 that I can grade alongside my other Sony cameras is a great virtue too.
And that is the spot where the mic you've just been hearing or suffering through crapped out, and I'm back to the mic that we started with, the mic that I wish we could have used as a technical matter with this whole deep dive into the menus we just did. But if there's some way to salvage this long dive into the RX0, it might be just to conclude with an adage. And the adage that I've heard often about cameras is the best one you've got is the one you've got with you. So that's how I think the RX0 will make its way into my future. Not A, not B, maybe a C, potentially a D, probably an E camera.